Good afternoon, church. My name is Kwame Salkumsen, and I'm doing the reading on the parable of the lost son. So we'll start with Luke chapter 15, verse 1 to 2, and then verse 11 to 32. It's on page 1048. Now, the tax collectors and sinners were all gathered around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in the whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of the country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the elder son was in the field. When he came near to the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. And 'Your brother has come,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound.' The elder brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, 'Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, come home, you kill the fattened calf for him.' 'My son,' the father said, 'you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' This is the word of the Lord.
There we go. Hey everyone, my name is James. It's good to see you. I was up here preaching last week and I asked a question, and it wasn't rhetorical. I was hoping for an answer. And it felt like a long, awkward pause before eventually my wife Joey took pity on me and shouted out the answer. I'm going to start with a question today. So, brave start already. I'm hoping if you know the answer, you're going to shout it out, okay? So, in Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back, there's a big plot twist. I hope I'm not ruining it for anyone, but it's been out for 40 years, so if you haven't seen it, then don't blame me. Luke and Darth Vader are fighting, and Luke accuses Darth Vader of killing his father, at which point Darth Vader responds with a really famous line, which is, Luke, I am your father. Except, if you watch it back, he doesn't actually say that. Luke, I am your father. He doesn't say that. What he says is, no, I am your father. Luke, I am your father is the most misquoted movie line of all time. He doesn't say it, even though I can literally hear it in my head, him saying it. He doesn't say it. And sometimes, when things seem really familiar to us, we can miss what it is they actually say. And this story, which just by coincidence is in a book called Luke, and it's about a father, is really well known. It's a really well-known story. And you probably know it whether you're a Christian or not. But because it's so familiar, it's often easy to miss the point of what it's actually trying to say to us. The context of this story is really important. We heard it read by Kwame. It's the first 2 verses of Luke 15. If you look back at those first 2 verses, it tells us the context that Jesus is telling the story in. It says, now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, they're the upstanding, law-abiding citizens, they're angry. And they mutter, this man welcomes sinners and eats with them. And it's easy to read that and think, aren't the Pharisees so judgmental? I think that's how most people read it most of the time. But if we understand what tax collectors were like, perhaps we might change our minds. Tax collectors were Jewish people who were in cahoots with the Romans, who were the occupying forces. They collected Roman taxes from Jewish people, but they didn't just collect the amount that the Romans wanted. They added more, and they kept the extra for themselves. And so not only were they working with the occupying forces, but they were also exploiting their own people by overcharging them. They were using the protection of the Romans to get away with it. These tax collectors are not helpless outcasts who have been neglected by society. Jesus definitely does care about those people, but that's not what these tax collectors are like. These are people who have very deliberately turned their back on their own people because they can make money out of it. How do we feel about British soldiers who sell secrets to Russia, or people who left the UK to join ISIS? Jesus is eating with those kinds of people. And so the Pharisees say, doesn't he realize who he's eating with? Self-serving, greedy, treacherous people. To which Jesus doesn't say, trust me, they're not that bad really, just get to know them, they're good people really. He doesn't say that. Jesus says, selfish? Let me show you selfish. And he tells a really famous story about a man who has 2 sons, and the younger son is like the one who goes off to join ISIS, or the one who sells secrets to Russia. If you look at verse 11, that's where it starts. The younger son says to his father, give me my share of the estate now. And in Jewish culture, the inheritance passed from parents to children when the parents died. And so this request it will be unheard of. It will be like saying, Dad, I would rather you were dead because I want your money more than I want to know you. It's an outrageous thing to ask. Self-serving, greedy, and treacherous. And he takes all the money and off he goes to a distant country, and all that money that his father gives him, he wastes. Think about all the days the father spent working on his land to save up all that money to provide for his family. Long days, hard work in a hot Middle Eastern sun, all to provide for his family. And within a few days or weeks, all of it's gone. wasted in what's just described as wild living. Self-serving, it's greedy, it's treacherous. And then things start to go wrong. If you look at verse 14, after he'd spent everything, there was a severe famine in the whole country, and he began to be in need. So he hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. If you're a Jewish boy, there is nothing more shameless that you could do than go and work with pigs. But that's where he ends up. And worse than that, he's so hungry that he's desperate to eat the pig food because it's better than anything else that he has to eat. The selfish, greedy, treacherous boy ends up shameless, pathetic, and desperate. And in the absolute depths, he remembers Dad. If you look at verse 17, look at what specifically he remembers about his dad. It's the food. It's not, oh man, I was so bad to him, I should really make it up to him. I should really repair that relationship. It's not that. It's, oh man, I'm really hungry, and he's got food. Maybe I should go back to him. It's still self-serving and greedy. He hasn't changed. And so he sets off back to his father, and this is where the really famous scene comes in. As he's still a long way off, his father sees him, his father runs to him, throws his arms around him, embraces him, kisses him, and welcomes him back into the family. They kill the fattened calf, they celebrate, and the father says, "This, my son, was dead, he's alive again, he was lost, but now he's found." It's an amazing end to the story. The selfish, greedy, treacherous younger son is welcomed back into the family. We call it the parable of the prodigal son, the son who goes off and recklessly spends everything, but ends up forgiven. If I could sum up the story in one word, I don't know what word you'd use. The word that I would use is grace. The son deserves nothing, but he gets everything. We'd use the word grace to mean that. Deserves nothing, gets everything. It's a story about grace. But here's the thing. The story isn't really about the younger son. If you know this story, and I guess you do know the story, I'm going to guess that the way you would read it is, this is the parable of the prodigal son, then there's a little caveat at the end about his moody older brother. That's how most people read it, isn't it? But that's not how we're supposed to read it. This is really, I think, a parable about the older son. And that's not to say we don't learn lots and lots from the younger son, particularly about grace. We heard about him last week. You can go back and listen. Loads about God and about the son and about grace. But if you see this whole story as the younger son with a bolt on about his moody brother, you miss the point that Jesus is trying to show to us. The older brother, he's the opposite of his younger sibling. He's hardworking, upstanding in the community, sensible. He's been out working in the field, and as he gets near the house, he hears music and dancing. Strange. Since his little brother's gone, usually the house is pretty quiet. What's going on? And so he calls a servant and asks, "What's going on?" "Your brother's back." Yeah. You know the one who took all your dad's money and wasted it all? He's back. Yeah, isn't it great? And you know that fattened calf that you've been feeding every single day? Yeah, we've killed it. Honestly, I have never had steak like it. It is insane. What? And don't tell me you wouldn't react the same. What? Like your little brother loses his pocket money, even though you warned him about putting it in his wallet, and then your parents give him more? What? That's not fair. Or your sister does no work for her GCSEs, gets one decent grade, and your parents pay for her holiday, even though you worked much harder and did much better? What? That's not fair. And we'll dig into this part of the story this afternoon. But just let me show you why I think it's the older brother who is the main focus of the parable that Jesus is telling. The two brothers are supposed to represent the two groups of people we heard about in verses 1 and 2. So the younger son is the tax collectors and sinners. The older son is the Pharisees and teachers of the law. It's the Pharisees who complain about Jesus. They say, this man welcomes sinners and eats with them. And so Jesus tells this story in response to the Pharisees. He's telling it to them. And so it makes sense that the character that represents the Pharisees would be the main focus of the story. But then also, the younger son's story arc is complete. If you think about his story, the parable really cleverly uses distance to show what's going on. So look at the younger son's story. He goes off to a distant land, wastes all the money, then he comes back, and while he's still a long way off, his father sees him, runs to him, and welcomes him back into his house. And the younger son ends up back in the house. The older son never goes off. He stays near. And when he hears the music, he comes near the house. His father comes out to him. But he doesn't go in. The story ends before he goes in. It ends with him outside the house with a choice to make. Because the older son's story arc isn't complete yet. It's a parable about him. The story ends by confronting him with a question. It's the same question that it confronts the Pharisees with, and actually it's the same question that it confronts us with as we read the story today. It's what I'm calling today's talk. The question is, how do you respond to the Father's grace? The younger son's story is all about grace. The older son's story asks, how do you respond to that grace? When the older son finds out what's going on, he gets angry. Look down at verse 28. The older brother became angry, refused to go in. And so his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, look, all these years I've been slaving for you. I have never disobeyed any of your orders, yet you never gave me even a young goat so that I could celebrate with my friends. But then this son of yours comes home, who squanders your property with prostitutes, and you kill the fattened calf for him. And here we get the big insight into what the older son is like. If you look back at verse 21, I know we're jumping around a bit. Look at verse 21. What's the first thing the younger son says to his father? First word he says is, Father. If you look down at verse 29, what's the first word the older son says to his father? Look. And then he goes on to say, all these years I've been slaving for you. The older son lives in the house, but he completely misunderstands that he even has a father. He doesn't say father, he says, look, all these years I've been slaving for you. I'm not your son, I'm a servant. He's in the house, but he doesn't realize he has a father. And the cruel irony is that the older son is just as lost as his younger brother, but it's much harder for him to see. The younger son went far away, and it's so obvious to everyone who sees him that he is lost. It becomes obvious to him as well. But when he comes home, he ends up back in his father's house. The older brother stays near, but because he's near, he's blinded to the fact that he doesn't end up in his father's house. It's a much more subtle but deep-rooted kind of lostness compared to his brother. It's a lostness of self-justification. I've been slaving for you. I've never disobeyed any of your orders. I deserve your love. My brother doesn't. Look what he's done. And so for you to show grace to him, it's not fair, because he doesn't deserve it, and I do. Psychologist Jonathan Haidt, in his book The Righteous Mind, writes about how humans have what he calls an inner press secretary. You know, like a press secretary, they work for the president, and basically the job of the press secretary is to spin everything the president says to sound good. It's quite a hard job. But they say like, yeah, I know he said that, but really what he meant is this, and they'll try and spin it so it sounds good. His theory is that the brain is like an inner press secretary, and what it does is it spins everything to reflect positively on you. And the interesting thing from a psychological point of view is that this intuition, which is what he calls it, comes before any reasoning. So before you've even had the chance to think about it, your brain has already decided that you're right and spun how you think about yourself to believe that you are. So last week, Jerry and I had, not an argument, but a discussion about our car keys. Because the rule in our house is that car keys live in a little basket by the door. Because that makes sense. As you're leaving, pick up the car keys, out you go. And I came down for work one morning, the car keys weren't in the basket. So I reminded Jerry about, how the house rules work. They live in the basket. I found the spare keys, and off I went to work. And a couple of hours into my working day, I put my hand in my pocket, and I don't know how they got there. But there are the car keys. And my first thought was, why did Jerry put them in my trouser pocket? Which is ridiculous, right? It's stupid. But what your brain does, and you do it too, it's not just me, your brain will convince you that you are right before you've even had the chance to think about it. And if you still don't believe me, just wait till the next time a co-worker or a sibling or your spouse accuses you of something, even if it's true, your brain's already decided you're right before you've had the chance to think about it. As humans, our default nature is to self-justify. And it's so easy to spot the effects of that in the world around us, particularly think about the growing polarization of our society. Jonathan Haidt writes his book, The Righteous Mind, about that issue. He's trying to challenge and tackle the issue of polarization, helping people to understand themselves better. But his point, and it seems to be true, is that self-justifying people end up polarized. And so now we see things like MPs cancelling hustings because they've received too many death threats, or rises in both Islamophobia and anti-Semitism since the start of the war in Gaza. Because self-justifying people end up polarized. The same is true of the older brother. Look at how he compares himself to his younger brother. He says, "I've never disobeyed any of your orders, but when this son of yours, who squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him." He can't even call him his brother. "This son of yours, not my brother. Your son, but not my brother." But the effects of self-justification are even more profound at the individual level. You know the feeling when someone else gets chosen for a promotion over you, or somebody else wins player of the match when you think that you deserved it, or when someone else just seems to always get listened to when you don't. And you know the cycle of self-assurance followed by self-doubt, maybe even self-loathing, when things go well, followed by things going badly, based on however you perform in whatever metric your brain tells you is the one that's worth considering. You give a great presentation at work and everything is right with the world, and then the next one doesn't go so well, and suddenly things look much bleaker. You know the saying, right? You're only as good as your last ... whatever that ... is. It's a bit like being in a little boat in the open sea. One minute you're sitting pretty in the sun, next minute you're being bashed by the waves. It's exhausting. And this is what Henri Nouwen, who I quoted last week, writes about how he identifies with the son's self-justification. He says, "Condemnation of others and self-condemnation, self-righteousness and self-rejection keep reinforcing each other in an ever more vicious way. Every time I allow myself to be seduced by it, it spins me down an endless spiral of self-rejection." In the film The Chariots of Fire, there's a sprinter called Eric Liddell. He's a Christian. It's about him running at the 1924 Olympics. One of his famous quotes is, "When I run, I feel God's pleasure." It's about how he runs and wins a medal in the 400 meters. That film has a second runner, The second character who's a runner is called Harold Abrahams, and this is what he says about his motivation. It's very different from Eric Liddell. He says, "Contentment, I'm 24 and I've never known it. I'm forever in pursuit, and I don't even know what it is that I'm chasing." And then later on, he's describing running the 100 meters, and he says, "I'll raise my eyes and look down that corridor, 4 feet wide, with 10 lonely seconds to justify my whole existence. But will I? I can imagine the older brother saying exactly the same kind of thing. And I do it too. I was sat writing this sermon yesterday, and there's a voice in my head saying, other people will phrase things so much better than you can. And it's so easy for all of this just to become 30 lonely minutes to justify my whole existence. I wonder what it is for you. It will be something. I think part of being human is it will be something. The test is, what is it that you can't bear to fail at? And what is it that you end up daydreaming succeeding about? They will be the things. When I do this, it's my chance to justify my whole existence. The reason the lostness of the younger son is so profound is that often those things are good things. The older son is probably the model child, hardworking, respectful, obedient, never in trouble, often doing good. But if he's doing those things to earn his father's love, he's missed the point. You could be the model member of your community. You could be the model Christian. But if you're doing it to justify yourself, then you've missed the point. You've missed grace. It's a grace that subverts our understanding because the screw-up son ends up in and the model son doesn't. It's grace. And so the father comes out and explains to his son. He says, "Son, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours." He's saying, there's nothing you could do to earn my love. There's nothing you could do to justify yourself in my eyes, because you're my son, and I love you. Stop trying to earn your place. Recognize that the same grace that your younger brother received is on offer for you as well. But now that the father has invited the son back in, the older son has to make a choice. Now that his father has explained grace to him, the younger son has to answer that question. How do you respond to the father's grace? There's no more neutral answer. Either he can go into the house with his father, or he can stay on the outside. But both are choices. Now that he understands that his father is a man of grace, even to those who mess up, he has to choose whether to accept that grace for himself or to reject it. But there's no in between. The thing about Jesus is that he separates people, not actually by his choice, but by our choice. Remember that this story is told to two groups of people. Already they'd separated themselves out to two groups. Jesus doesn't separate people into those who believe in him and those who don't. That's not how he separates people. Nor is it that he separates people by those who agree with his teachings and those who don't. I've heard increasingly people recently saying that some of the solutions to the world's problems are a return to Christian ethics, Christian teachings. Maybe it's true. I think it probably is true. Even Richard Dawkins is saying that. But that's not how Jesus separates people. Jesus separates people between those who accept his grace and those who reject it. There's no in between. Either you come into the house or you stay on the outside, but you can't live in the doorway. It's one or the other, isn't it? And so the story leaves us wondering, which way does the older son go? He's been confronted with grace. Where does he go? He goes in one of two directions. If we follow the story in one direction, it goes like this. The older son says his piece to his father. He makes his complaint, and he's expecting that his anger will be met with more anger, because that's how the world works. He's raised his voice, he's waiting for his father to raise his voice back, and he's ready to raise his voice even louder, because this is an argument that he has to win. But that's not how his father responds. His father looks at him and listens to him. And after what feels like an age, his father says, "My son." And in hearing those simple words, it's like something in his mind clicks for the first time as he realizes that he's never seen himself as a son before. He knew in theory that he had a father, but he'd never seen himself as a son before. He'd always convinced himself that he needed to do something or be someone to be worthy of that love. He listened to that lie so many times that it had started to become true. And he thinks about all of the ways that he tried to earn his way to his father, and he hears his father say, "You are always with me, and everything I have is yours." And as those words wash over him, it's like something lifts, like a weight that he didn't even know he was carrying around with him suddenly floats off. And so he goes into the party, and the steak is just as good as they said it was. And it doesn't happen overnight, but day by day, he starts to learn that he doesn't need to achieve anything or earn anything for approval. He doesn't need to convince himself of his rightness anymore. He even starts to forgive his brother. And the story ends with 2 lost sons being found. One lost son who went far away, and one lost son who stayed at home. Both end up found. Or, the older son listens as his father pleads to him to come in, but his mind is already made up. He knows that he has worked hard day after day for his father's approval, and he knows just how messed up his younger brother is. Everybody else might miss it, but he knows. His little brother is selfish and greedy and lazy. He always has been. There is no way that I am going into a party that celebrates him. And so he stays on the outside. And day by day he watches as his little brother, his selfish, lazy, greedy little brother, gets doted on by his father. Whatever he wants, he seems to get. It's like he's completely hoodwinked his father. All of the love and affection that should have been mine seems to be going to him instead. That resentment builds and builds until eventually, one night, the older son decides to enact his plan. In the middle of the night, when everyone is asleep, he tiptoes into his father's room, and he looks down at his sleeping father and thinks, "How could you get it so wrong? Why did you never see that I'm the one you should be celebrating, not that other son of yours? How did you let him convince you to welcome him home and celebrate him after all he's done, and do nothing for me after all I've done? How could you be so stupid?" And then he takes his father's pillow and he pushes it hard into his father's face, and he holds it there unrelenting until justice is finally done. And you're probably going, whoa, 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 whoa. Whoa, that's not in there. Like, where did that come from? Like, it's his dad. Like, what's going on? But let me show you my working. In the story, the older brother represents the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, who are offended by the choices that Jesus is making about who to spend time with and who to show grace to. And so Jesus tells them this parable, asking them the same question that he asks us: how do you respond to the Father's grace? And he leaves them at the end of the story with a decision to make. How are you going to respond? And if we control F for Pharisees and teachers of the law throughout the rest of Luke's gospel, we see how they respond. A few chapters later, chapter 19, we read that every day Jesus was teaching at the temple, but the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the leaders among the people were trying to kill him. And then chapter 20, they're trying to arrest Jesus. Chapter 22, they're looking for a way to get rid of Jesus. And by chapter 23, after Jesus has been arrested, the chief priests and the teachers of the law were standing there vehemently accusing him. And so Pontius Pilate, who's in charge, offers the people a choice: either set Jesus free or Barabbas free. Barabbas is a murderer. Jesus has only ever talked about grace. And in the Bible, names are really important. The name Barabbas means son of the father. And so you go, oh, there's a screw-up son of a father. I read about one of those in Luke 15. And now here we are, a screw-up son of the father. Who's going to go free? Him or Jesus? And the crowd, who are stirred up by the chief priests, shout, "We want Barabbas. Crucify Jesus. We want Barabbas." And that's exactly what happens. The screw-up son of the father walks free because of grace. It's grace that took Jesus all the way to the cross. The question for us is, how do we respond to the Father's grace? A grace that Jesus was so committed to that it took him to his death. So that anyone who's ever messed up, just like the Son of the Father, can walk free. And so I want to finish just by talking briefly about two people who decided to respond to that grace. That's the question we get asked. How do we respond to that grace? So here are two people. The first one, this is Caro Weber. I think that's how you say it. She's Canadian. She grew up in Canada. Super smart. When she was in her 20s, she came to Oxford on a scholarship to study romantic poetry. She arrives in Oxford as an academically brilliant woman, perfectionist, overachiever, but emotionally quite guarded, fairly deep wounds from her father who let her down too many times. And over time, she begins to open herself up to the possibility of the existence of God. She meets people who are deep thinkers and Christians, but clever. She's not met people with all three of those before. And she starts to think, maybe there's something in this. And one of her friends takes her to see this painting, which is called The Light of the World, which is ironically very dark. It's called The Light of the World. It's by someone called William Holman Hunt, hangs in Keble College in Oxford. They look at it together. It's inspired by a verse in Revelation where Jesus says, "I stand at the door and knock." And it's in Oxford. They're quite cultured, so they look at it for a while. They kind of stand there taking it in. And Caro has this sense that maybe Jesus is knocking on her heart, asking her to let him in. But just before they leave, Caro says to her friend, "Hang on, there's a mistake in the painting." Her friend says, "What do you mean?" "Look at the door. The handle is missing. How will Jesus open the door?" And her friend replies, "The artist didn't forget anything, Caro. In fact, he remembered. The door can only be opened from the inside." Jesus' grace confronts us, but it also leaves us free to respond. It's like it bulldozes everything except our free choice. And eventually, Caro does respond to Jesus' grace. One night, it's Valentine's Day. She writes about it like this: "To be one person one moment lost, then another person the next moment found, is the difference, as the saying goes, between night and day. Outwardly, I seemed the same, but inwardly, everything had changed. I went to the window and watched the birth of the dawn. Everything appeared in this better light, this brighter light. This is the ultimate Valentine. The Lord is my light. Surprised by Oxford, the birthday of my life came. Yes, my love came to me." As you'd expect for someone studying romantic poetry, she writes in a really beautiful way. She tells her story in this book. It's called Surprised by Oxford. Great story about how someone can come to faith in Jesus. But if you're an achiever, like Caro, like the older son, if you're the sort of person that judges yourself by your achievements, Jesus invites you to respond to a love that will change everything. And then secondly, this is C.S. Lewis. You've probably heard of him. You know the S stands for Staples. When did we stop naming kids after stationery? Staples. He was also super clever. He was an atheist, but he was captivated by what he described as joy. But when he talked about joy, he didn't really mean joy like how we use the word joy. He was talking about a much deeper, more like kind of aching, longing for something that he felt was at the heart of what it means to be human. He talked about this German word Sehnsucht, which he struggled to translate, but joy was his best translation of these pangs of that deep, aching, longing for something. He translated it joy. If you've ever watched a beautiful sunset or held a newborn baby or connected really deeply with someone, you probably know that feeling that he's talking about, this joy, deep longing that hits at our hearts but somehow leaves us wanting something even deeper. And C.S. Lewis's search for joy leads him to become a Christian. And reluctantly at first, he calls himself the most reluctant convert in all of England. He doesn't want to. He tells his story in the book Surprised by Joy. And at the end of the book, which is all about his quest for joy, C.S. Lewis concludes that actually that feeling of joy is just the signpost. He concludes that all those pangs of longing, as intense as they are only ever signposts pointing us towards the source of joy, which Lewis found to be God himself. I think the older son would have experienced that. He spent his whole life living on his father's land with all the blessings that should have brought, but without any sort of meaningful relationship with the one those blessings were coming from. It was like he was seeing the signposts, but never following them. And so if you're a longer, if you feel a deeper desire in you than ever seems to be satisfied by the things that you've searched in, the invitation that Jesus gives is to find the person that those longings are pointing you towards. I made the point earlier that this parable is not really the parable about the younger son. It's also not really the parable about the older son. It's really the parable of a father's love, parable of a father's grace. The father's grace to a selfish, greedy, screw-up younger son, and the father's grace to a self-righteous and bitter older son. But the question that the whole story leads us with is, how do you respond to a grace like that? Okay, I think the band are going to come up. Why don't we stand? I'm going to say a prayer to close, and then we'll sing a couple of songs to finish. I'm going to say a prayer that you can pray whether you've been a Christian for a long time or no time at all, but just a prayer that's going to help us to respond to the love of the Father. So let's pray. Father, some of us might relate to that younger son. We might know that we have screwed up. We might know that we feel far from you. And if that's us, we want to say that we want to come home. Would you welcome us back? No matter how far we've been, would you welcome us back in? And some of us, I think, might relate more to the older son. We might have different ways that we measure our success, different ways that we try to earn the love of you or those around us. And we want to say that we want to come home too. Would your grace change us? Would your grace show us that we are not slaves but children. Lord, would you welcome us back in as we come back to you? Amen.